Hello and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at in the world. My name is Erin Wagoner, Foundation Specialist with Corporate Partner Services for Chime. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, How to Catch and Stop Cyber Attacks on Healthcare Devices. Before we get started with the presentation, I'm going to cover a few technical details. The Q&A area is located on your screen option bar. This will allow you to ask questions during today's presentation. To ask a question, type your message inside the Q&A chat box and press the send key. Our speakers are going to try and answer questions during the session. So if you think of a question, type it in sooner rather than later so that we can be sure to address it during the session. Now, if you're having difficulty listening to the live audio stream through your computer speakers, teleconferencing is available. To display teleconference instructions, click on the Communicate menu to view your audio options. Also, by attending today's session, you may earn up to 1 continuing education credit. Be sure to visit the Chime website for more details. We also ask that you please take a few moments to complete the evaluation that will automatically pop up at the end of the session in your web browser. Your feedback is valuable for all of our future programming. And just one last quick reminder, all registrants for this event will receive a link to the session recording along with a PDF of the slide deck. Now, with all that said, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today that's going to get things started off for us, Jake Milstein. He is the CMO with Critical Insight. Jake, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks. Hey, Erin. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, a couple quick notes of gratitude. One, thank you very much to Chime, both for hosting the Fall Forum and then hosting us here this week. Erin's awesome. For those of you who know her, you know that. Second, obviously, today is Veterans Day, and both we and I work at Critical Insight and Armis want to thank the folks who served. I know at the Chime Fall Forum last week, I met an awesome CIO who came right out of the Air Force. And anyway, thank you for your service. And then third, thanks to everybody who, has worked in hospital environments through the pandemic. Not that it's over or anything, but you all do amazing work, and thank you. So we're here to talk about how to catch and stop cyber attacks on healthcare devices. And this might be a little bit of an unusual webinar, panel, whatever we're calling it. Format. So what Erin said is right. I'll take questions as we go, and I'm really excited to interrupt Summit, Mike, and John. And part of that is also, obviously we're two vendors, but we're working together here. And when I was at the Chime Fall Forum in San Diego, one of the things that one of the folks said up on stage was, "When will my vendors start working together?" ? And it's this frustration that, I can buy this from this vendor and that from that vendor, but they don't integrate, and then they expect us to integrate them. And that's ridiculous. And that is ridiculous. And so one of the things that we're here today to talk about is, is how to get vendors working together in the way that we are. This is not a sales presentation at all, but I did hear that last week, and here we are answering that. So they're not really all three CISOs right now, but I'm going to call them that because that was in their titles at one point. So John Delano is at Christus Health now, former CIO and CISO. Mike Hamilton is founder of Critical Insight, cybersecurity company in Seattle, former CISO of the city of Seattle. And Sumit Sehgal is at Armis, and he is a former CISO from Boston. And with that, so this is a slide that John Delano threw over to me and said, hey, he gave a presentation to HIMSS several years back about where IoT was going to go. John, were you right?
Well, Jake, there's certainly lots of consumer devices on the market today. We're all familiar with many of them, certainly things like smartwatches. And certainly one of my favorite is the wearable baby monitor, where the socks that you put on your baby that measures breathing and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of creative consumer products out there, but what hasn't come to fruition is really using these devices as clinical decision support. So according to Gartner, and this was a couple of years ago, 75% of healthcare endpoints are still really RTLS tags. So putting RTLS tags on devices, it's hard to call a wheelchair with an RTLS tag an IoT device, but that's the new terminology. And certainly we have things like smart buildings, so elevators, HVAC, things that we've put on the network to do predictive maintenance. We've seen a few things in the DME side, so CPAP machines and other things that are actively sending data. But for the most part, we have not seen these devices make their way into the medical community. My question is, will we be ready when they come in and are being used as clinical decision tools? And we did ask that question a couple of years ago in a Chime focus group, a CIO focus group. And certainly CIOs agree that medical devices today are an issue, but IoMT, so this Internet of Medical Things, was still a few years away. And secondarily, I think we need the time to be ready for the real issue, which is the data that these devices generate. According to IBM, we're generating 2.5 quintillion bytes of data per day. And that's more than the past 5,000 years, I believe, of history. So certainly data is going to be a big issue, especially from a security perspective. So how do we ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data? And it's also going to require us to rethink the traditional architecture and how we do data management.
And Mike, you wanted to talk about the news coming around.
Yeah, I always want to talk about the news. I just wanted to kind of set the stage and see if we can frame things a little bit here. So I thought this was pretty prescient, these 3 barriers to achieving medical device security. And so out-of-date devices, lack of visibility, and the fact that the threat landscape is dynamic. Right? Yesterday's threats are already a thing of the past. And then it is not gone unnoticed by the FDA that this is a bit of a blind spot. This is an area where we have an exposure that we need to address. And I think the talk around this all started with Dick Cheney's pacemaker, right? Which was, frankly, a real thing. We got a vice president who has a device, and that device could be attacked, and we could have a bad outcome. Well, now the conversation is expanded, and you see that now that the FDA knows that this is a risk, they're seeking more regulatory oversight. And part of that regulatory oversight is aligned with what the federal government just did in terms of an executive order about this software bill of materials. And so there are things going on at the federal level that will help this problem, but the transition into a secure condition is going to take a while. And so until that all occurs, we need to talk about these things like a lack of visibility, out-of-date devices, and the fact that, the threats are dynamic and you got to stay in front of them. So, to summarize all this, it's interesting to see the progress that the federal government has made just in the last couple of months with these ransomware operators. Sanctioning the crypto exchanges, calling them out. We've got a couple of them identified. We've already extradited one. That is going to help tamp things down. It's not going to go away for a while. Just the federal government starting to call the use of ransomware and other disruptive tools against critical infrastructure, specifically the health sector. That got them to back off a little bit, and now we're going to throw a few of them in Gitmo, and that's probably going to move the needle even more. But we still have all these devices. They're still insecure. Nobody sees what's going on in the network, and so that's where we are today.
And, when you think of those devices, the problem with out-of-date devices, like this one on the right. And by the way, this is one that's recalled, and I hope out of every environment. Mike?
Well, I mean, somewhat problematically, I just talked about good stuff that the FDA was doing. There are many who would complain about the FDA and the fact that they can't seem to certify upgraded operating systems and software in some of these devices because their process takes so long and because they have to work with the vendors to do it. So there's this big lag there. You really need to be able to, but with out of date devices, you gotta know what's on the network. You have to monitor their activity. And if you have a good inventory of these devices, and their attributes, which you can look at, we can't spray packets around a network to go probe for things. This needs to be intentionally passive. And there needs to be some kind of vulnerability detection there. So, and this is a good trick, right? We don't do this. That's why we partner with Armis. But if you have the ability to identify inventory of those devices and enumerate vulnerabilities, and you combine that with your own network monitoring, all of a sudden, when you have some kind of aberrational event, you can get in front of it. And there's an example of an aberrational event right there. Why would an insulin pump try to talk to the internet? Well, that kind of thing happens. And interestingly, too, there are IoT botnets that continue to expand. And these types of things are the targets of those. And what they're used for a lot is denial of service attacks. And you don't want medical IoT being used to knock somebody off the internet. That damages the optics around that are real bad. It's brand damaging. So, but then what's key here is once we've categorized, identified these things, and you have monitoring going on that will throw off alerts. Hey, we just saw something weird. Somebody's got to get the alert. Somebody's going to have to act on those things. So out-of-date devices are going to continue to be a problem until we reach this threshold where this software bill of materials, right? We have to know the provenance of everything that goes into these devices, what kind of libraries they use, what's the operating system, et cetera, so that we can know when there is a vulnerability. Because a lot of times today, there are embedded libraries and things in there that are open source, that are not maintained. And these are the kinds of things that go bad. And when they go bad, they persist in a bad state for a long time, unless you know that those components are in there. So don't want to be scary, but until the FDA and the federal government get this straightened out, we're going to have to up the radar to make sure that we know what's going on in the network. And that means you need visibility into not only what is there, but how does it behave?
That's interesting, right? So Mike, that's an excellent point you made together with John. On the device itself, right? It's when you look at the totality of the healthcare ecosystem, right? I often joke that, hey, no two hospitals, even though they provide care the same way. So that's the important thing to note, that when your organization is embarking about a medical device security strategy, sometimes it's more than just the medical devices that need to be focused on as well. John took that example of the elevator control systems, right? I've had conversations, both myself when I was at Boston Medical Center and GW, where we would do drills of, hey, we're in a city environment. Our emergency department is on the first floor, OR suites on the second floor, our ICU is on the 10th floor, right? There is a threat model that's attached to, hey, if we take out the elevator controls, it has real impact on patient movement. Same thing when you're talking about HVAC, for pressure control and temperature control in an OR suite. When you're talking about temperature control for vaccines and medication storage, things like lab and pharmacy automation, environmental control systems. Sometimes health systems that I know, even here in Illinois, are using robotics for meal delivery to patients, right? So that's what this picture is kind of summarizing when we talk about the healthcare device ecosystem. It's really taking into account the view from medical devices and extending it from more than the patient to the infrastructure that powers the clinical support for delivery of care for that patient. And one of the things that happens here is the light bulb moment. When you start going towards a medical device security strategy, you end up with order of magnitude higher visibility into what you have in your environment, and that creates a problem of scope. This is why one of the things that's happened in the industries and over the last 3 to 4 years, it's been just the concept of, hey, I bought a solution to help me figure out what I have, but I don't have people to do with it. I don't have training to deal with it. I have an issue of time and budget to manage it, right? So focusing in your health system with regard to what are your emphasis on either compliance requirements, your emphasis on any kind of competitive advantages that you're making, to isolate the scope instead of trying to do everything, to bring it down to a specialty level, or looking at strategic development, helps you do this organically. And it also helps you trace what we at Armis call securing the patient journey, which is put it in terms of a joint commission tracer that you have to go through, where they essentially trace the patient workflows, and to Mike's point, be able to understand the data flows for the devices and the interactions of those devices with the clinical people as the patient goes through the different parts of the health system. Next slide, please. So when you do this, one of the things that is a lot of the conversation, and Mike was talking about this a lot in his portion, was threat modeling, right? The ability to have appropriate translation from what's done in the academic or applied research side, the stuff that you see in the news coming out with whatever type of devices can be hacked and their potential impact, and applying them to your environment. The reason this is very, very important is because most organizations still today have a fairly high level view of how this should be done, as opposed to what is actually performed on the security operations and threat and vulnerability management areas, right? So one of the examples I like to give here is taking the pacemaker analogy. In your health system, you may have 5 different types of pacemakers that are deployed to your patients. And depending upon the 5, even though they all maintain heart rhythms, they may function differently, they may communicate differently, they may have different, like Mike said, downstream software materials that are installed into them, and they may exchange information differently. That is critical to know when you're creating threat models for you that take what you do from a vulnerability analysis perspective and give you a very specific model for your environment in your location for the types of patients you serve, that helps you identify, how am I going to bring together security incident operations together with emergency response from a recovery perspective. That is very critical. And in this example that you see on the screen, we kind of break it up based on the type of device, whether it's an IT device, whether it's a medical device, whether it's a building management system. Those all are connected, right? So when you go down this path of creating a security strategy for this section, you end up with visibility for the first time in that, and creating a process through which you can simulate what the incentives are versus how those incentives for violation of those vulnerabilities apply to your environment. That is critical. Next slide, please.
So before we jump to the next slide, Mike and John, I want to bring you in here. So the, Stuxnet and Black Energy and WannaCry, are all things that, you all have dealt with, so, 2 questions. One, Mike, when you talk to, clients who have questions about specific attacks, what advice do you give them? And then, after that, John, how do you look at these different attacks?
So, what advice do we give about avoiding specific attacks? It's, the standards of practice that everybody needs to maintain through regulatory requirements is always the first place to start, right? Right. You got to do the blocking and tackling things. And I think I have a slide coming up to talk about a lot of those things. But a lot of these things, because the threats are dynamic, you have to keep on top of them. You have to know what is out there. What is the next threat that looks like it's targeting your sector? And there's a lot of open source reporting about this. And CISA, the DHS, critical infrastructure security agency, they put out tons of good information on things like this. And so ingesting that threat information and then using that to guide where you're going to apply your focus, especially if your resources are short, that's what I would say, because all of these have different introduction vectors, right? Summit laid it out really well. There are a lot of ways that this stuff happens, and it could percolate all the way to building management and elevators and HVAC and things like that. And then the consequences of that, could be loss of life. So, threat modeling this stuff out and then staying on top of what looks like it might be coming my way and what tactic is in use. That's the way to stay in front of these things. And it's a difficult job. I just say, I don't want to make it sound easy. It's a difficult job.
The good part here, Jake, is that from a technology capability perspective, right, this stuff can be done real time. That's not the problem. The problem a lot of times happens is the application of what Mike is saying, right? The application of standards, the application of security processes to clinical workflows. That's where it takes time to build, and that's the organic iteration of a maturity process, right? So I think, and I would venture further on to say simulations as well. I mean, the emergency department in healthcare organizations do this all the time with drills and stuff like that.
Yep.
So far, I mean, tabletop drills have a way, like they're important to be done, but it's nothing compared to an actual simulation of an incident where the systems are taken offline and you actually have to do the recovery. Case in point that I give is we did this with One Health System 3 years ago, and in the drill paper it said we are going to replace a pump and it's going to take us 5 minutes. Yes, 5 minutes to do that. You forgot to account for 10 minutes of that tech walking from the place to grab the pump and 10 minutes walking back. So that added 20 minutes to the chain per pump. So if you have 20 of these affected, you can see how it kind of snowballs.
Yeah, and John, you're of the guys on the panel, you're still the one in the hot seat. So two things. One, how do you deal with, two things. Yeah, one, so you have these sort of scary names at the top. Every now and then a board member or CEO will come and say, "In Destroyer, what are we doing about that?" And second is, sort of those tabletops. How often do you do them?
Yeah, so Jake, certainly looking at this slide makes you think of, lions, tigers, bears. Oh my, right? I mean, while you have to be prepared, this kind of stuff is difficult for the typically understaffed and underfunded security department. So, before I answer the other question, I would say this is why you need to have a good security partner, because I think it's difficult for the average information security department to keep up with all of the specific attacks that are out there. Certainly things that you can do, practice good cyber hygiene, that will in essence eliminate a lot of threats, but that also takes time and effort, typically not money, because it's things you can do like patching and passwords and things that don't typically cost a lot of money. But you mentioned tabletop exercises, and it takes a lot of time and effort to do those too. I think that you need to do those on a consistent basis. I would say probably twice a year if you could get away with it, but certainly once a year. You want it to be such that you have muscle memory in the event that you are under attack, because you don't want to be making decisions when you're under stress. And there are certainly time-sensitive decisions that have to be made, and things that are easy to get answered. Go to your executive leaders and ask the question, would we pay a ransom if we had to? Mm-hmm. You don't want to have to answer that question when your systems are down. You want to know what your stance is going into it. A lot of these ransoms require payment in cryptocurrency. So a lot of organizations go ahead and invest in that, so they have it on hand should they decide to pay a ransom. So I would say that you want to go through those exercises at least once a year, if not twice a year, to make sure that you build up muscle memory and are prepared.
Yeah, let me add just a little bit of that too, because Summit kind of brought this up. So in the public sector, we differentiate between a tabletop exercise and a functional exercise. Mm-hmm. And to Summit's point, and to what John was saying as well, occasionally, and maybe it's even every other year, a functional exercise where you actually do the deed. You need to restore from backup and figure out if that works, because a lot of times that's when you're going to get a real bad feeling and maybe this doesn't work and we need to fix this. So I'll just throw my 2 cents in there that a functional exercise is a real good idea. Doesn't have to be done at the same cadence as tabletops, but all this practice is real good.
Well, and especially with devices, like taking this device or that device, where, you know, if you don't know if there's, you know, sometimes in the beginnings of attack, you don't know where it's coming from. So, and a question for the audience here, and put in the chat, you know, I'm curious how often people do these tabletop or functional exercises, and whether you know, yeah. So put it in the chat. Curious to hear what people say. We'll head over to Summit's next slide here.
Perfect. So one of the things that happens is, like we've been talking about, right? When you start doing this properly in a even I would call it semi-formal manner, you start to see risk conversations branch off from number one, which is traditionally where most of security and risk conversation stays within that IT and information security realm, to now include things like clinical workflow, clinical operations safety, right? Life safety and those kind of things. But there's 2 tangential elements, like number 3 and number 4, we talk about, hey, it's not just about clinical quality and clinical safety. Yes, that is what we do as a health system. We also need to make sure we take care of how we pay our bills. Can we order supplies? So the continuity of operations or supply chain risks that are absolutely critical to making sure number 2 gets done. And most oftentimes, we tend to not talk about the human factors. I mean, you look at a traditional health system anywhere in the country, even for that matter in the world, you have generational differences. You have people in their 20s working together with people in their 60s, and how those groups of people take information, apply information, view security, and work through the issues of normal operations, let alone what Mike was talking about in a functional drill environment where things are off or degraded. That matters. So what I'm trying to say here is medical device security strategy programs have to account for risks in these 4 areas and bring them together. And this is traditionally still, I would say, not well done in health systems, where we have a decent amount of approach for business risk, enterprise risk. There's an approach for clinical quality and clinical and life safety risk, but those 2 often don't come together in a applicable way. So absolutely critical for doing this. And the good part is you can leverage that security strategy to build those layers on top of what you already have.
And, you know, Mike, I know you wanted to talk here about risk as well, and it's a talk you frequently give. And I do see a question from Carl that I'll get to in a second. So, Mike, do you want to address risk, and then I'll get to the question from Carl?
Yeah, sure. So, so first of all, you know, thinking about the generalized expression for risk, right? There's the likelihood of a bad outcome and its impact. And in order to buy down the risk, using the likelihood term, you apply preventive controls, firewalls, email filtering, you know, if you have an IPS system, antivirus / endpoint security, et cetera, right? And you do everything you can to buy down that risk, and you will never reduce the likelihood of a bad outcome to 0, right? So what's a bad outcome? Records disclosure, unauthorized disclosure of protected records, which the health sector knows very well. Theft and extortion, business email compromise and ransomware, theft and extortion. And the third one is just disruption for the sake of disruption, which is starting to happen more frequently now. Okay. So you buy down that risk by applying all these preventive controls, you're never going to reduce that likelihood to 0. Then you have to worry about the impact term. And the way to minimize impact, the way to buy down risk by focusing on the impact term, minimizing that impact, is you have to see something going on when your preventive controls have failed. You need visibility into that. You need a fast, effective response system to put out the little fire before the house is engulfed in flames. So, you know, just in terms of very generalized, here's how we handle risk. That's how I think about it. And then the other part of that is if you're addressing the technical risk that Summit brought up and talked about very well there, there are methods for doing that that are very, deep in the technical details, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're talking to executives about this, it's always about the money and continuity of operations, always. Okay, we know what it costs in the health sector. What's the number? It's about $400 a record to clean that up. You have 1 million records in your EHR. Okay, you have potential of $400 million in liability there. If that's at medium risk, then you have a potential of $200 million in potential liability there. And the conversation about, I need to spend $50,000 on controls to cut that risk in half again. Okay, you get $50 million in risk reduction for an outlay of $50,000. That's the way to have the conversation. Scary Russian cyber buffer overflow SQL injection impresses no one.
Yeah, and it's also helpful, just to add one anecdote to what Mike said. It's very important to have that conversation realistically with your board, because your risk appetite, if you're in the middle of Boston competing with 19 other health systems, competitively even, is going to be different than if your Erlanger Health System in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where the only game in town is 65 miles away.
Good point.
Right. So having that approach that's organizationally relevant is very, very important and helpful in having success.
And I do want to get to Carl's question here. How do you stratify and prioritize which devices to focus on first, second, et cetera? Summit?
So so the way I would approach this is, number one, if there are devices that the system's telling you have a life safety impact, gets treated first. Whether that's a recall potential problem, patient safety quality issue, those get treated first. Secondarily, if you don't have those situations, then you look at what Mike was saying from a compliance perspective. Is there issues of potential data loss that can cause you trouble from a regulatory perspective? If those are, if you go through that second list as well, then you start carving it down by area of importance for your health system. So this is where that scope conversation came in that I was talking about earlier. Is you may be in an organization that's hedging their bets, for example, for revenue, to say, hey, we're going to make our margin from an operating revenue perspective from these 3 specialties, right? In addition to all the normal care we provide. That becomes your scope. That helps you identify and isolate, not having to fix hundreds of thousands of problems, maybe down to 20, 30,000, right? The second area could be potential partnerships that you may be doing, or merger and acquisition activity that may be occurring in your health system that could take precedence as well. Strategic development is another angle that you can take to isolate scope as well. But all of these together, what I'm trying to say is there is no cookie cutter approach that happens. These will be different based on every health system. One thing, please do not forget, is the capability intrinsic to your own security, IT organization, of what your people can do and what they're trained to do, and not go beyond that, because you're going to get essentially the technology trying to work the people, and that's not what you want. The last part I would say is also, when you're trying to prioritize devices, it is important on the operational side as well, because IT people always frame their thinking of, hey, the system should be used in this way. And clinical people sometimes use it completely differently than what the IT people think they use it as. So bringing together a team that can say, hey, for these devices in question, what is the business impact? What is the operational impact from a workflow perspective? And then what is the clinical impact from a physician behavior, clinician, nurse behavior of use perspective? That can help you prioritize as well.
John, do you, do you see it the same way? And 2, you've worked in big organizations and small organizations. Do you prioritize it the same way?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with Summit there. You know, the other thing I would layer on is just the data that those devices collect, and having some kind of prioritization of that data would be beneficial as well. So, you know, certainly I agree, life safety impact, number 1. Number 2, we look at compliance and regulatory, and this would certainly fit into that that category. So it may not just be the medical use of the device, but also the data that the device generates.
Thanks. All right, Summit, next slide.
This is actually a good point to this, pivot to this is talking about the relevance of medical device security strategy, right? For folks that are on the call that are with us, the top part of the funnel, that's most of the capabilities of security solutions in this space today, right? That is what they do. A lot of times what happens is when you're looking at or embarking on these projects, they're either born out of IT security or they're born out of biomed. So having the understanding of how these solutions can integrate in your organization on the bottom side of the diagram here, whether it's talking about what Mike was saying, threat management, vulnerability management, essentially prioritization for security operations, that could be one value benefit. The second one could be on the clinical engineering side, whether you're doing it for cost control or asset tracking or for clinical quality initiatives to say, hey, are my CT scanners being leveraged in the best way possible? You have a lot of utilization data that gets provided through these solutions that allows you to integrate that with either the security or the IT or the clinical analytics engine to be able to showcase to you the examples of, hey, I have 5 CT scanners in my organizations, which are underutilized, which are overutilized. Bringing together things that Mike and John said about vulnerabilities and the types of makeups and focusing on the data, you can then take that approach to say, hey, I know what vulnerabilities all 5 of them have because I know what types they are. I also know how much times they're used. And in some cases, if I have visibility, I can go down to the what types of scans they're doing from a clinical acuity level as well. So now you have security data, you have utilization data that's operational, and you have clinical data. That's the first time that healthcare organizations have had the opportunity to bring those 3 together to make a holistic approach to what John was saying. Hey, the data matters, to be able to prioritize, to say, hey, if I have to patch all 5 of them, how would I prioritize that? And God forbid, if shit hit the fan and these 4 get compromised or 3 gets compromised, how would I prioritize the response to those? And how would I recover? What would that do to my revenue from an ambulatory perspective? Are these ambulatory CT scanners or ED CT scanners, right? The point I'm trying to make through this diagram is understand why you want to do this. It's very, very important. You're going to have auditors. You're going to have third-party internal audit, external audit, the industry saying you have to do this. Do it for what you need to do it for in your organization.
And I think that's brilliant. I think just bringing in, taking this out of just being an IT thing or an IT security thing. This is part of the business. We need to know clinically what the directives and what the outcomes we intend are, and all that needs to be ingested, aggregated for decisions. Yeah.
And hey, so speaking of that, and speaking of the fact that it's not just an IT problem, another question here from the audience goes back to the tabletop, but really does relate well, which is what stakeholders do you see frequently missing, maybe invited, but do not attend or don't contribute from tabletop exercises?
Finance, legal, HR, right? I mean, so if the stuff actually goes down, we're doing a tabletop. We're not talking about, we got malware on something, right? It's got to be some kind of soul crushing event. And those events are outside IT. The way that we structure it is we have an incident governance team that is always notified if there is an incident that's bigger than a bread box. And that governance team includes everyone I just talked about, right up to the CEO, because there may be decisions coming that are, we got to buy a bunch of stuff. We need to make public communications. We need to confine our own communications because we think a discovery process may be coming in litigation, right? That's where those people need to be at the table. And then they can designate the response team and the cadence with which the response team reports back up. That's a good way to structure it. But those people at the table, just even if it's only informing them and they're part of this, governance committee, they need to be involved.
John?
And Mike, I would completely agree, and I would add to your point about communications, marketing needs to be involved. because what's at stake is your brand.
Yep.
And you
Not a
certainly
fan of marketing, but you're right.
so you certainly want marketing there, and for the reasons going back to prior conversation about risk, you know, CEOs and leadership teams understand risk. They deal in risk every day, and IT risk or security risk is just a part of that. And so I completely agree. And one exercise that's worthwhile is asking the organization, what's your brand worth? And using that as an opportunity to invest in security programs, because like I said, at stake is potentially your brand and what your brand's worth.
I usually don't talk about this on these webinars, but I ran newsrooms for 25 years for NBC, CBS, Fox affiliates around the country. And I will tell you, I've seen many healthcare organizations deal with the press poorly and therefore their customers and the public. And I could go on, but, you know, be forthright, be clear. People understand that the ransomware attack or whatever attack was not your fault. Be clear with, I can go on. We don't have time for that.
And don't wear a striped shirt.
Well, yeah. And this is actually a good dovetail, right? So Mike, both of you talked about standardization. So for the folks on the call, drills should not traditionally be done through security or information or even IT. Drills should be coordinated through emergency management, because there's two standards. It's called National Incident Management System, NIMS, and there's a healthcare incident command system called HICS. Those two standards make sure all the appropriate channels in your organization, including clinical, have the appropriate pathways to do these drills appropriately. That's what is followed when there's an active shooter. That's what's followed when there's an earthquake type of situation. So to your question on who's missing and who doesn't show up, it's because they either don't have trust in your drill, or B, they don't know the language you're talking. So this using those frameworks can actually help you do your drills more effectively. And then you piggyback all the security stuff behind it. It actually provides you, to Mike's point, how they divvy up logistics, operations, and finance and everything together from a capability perspective. It allows you to scale your response and recovery. So it's actually a perfect dovetail into this, is to say, hey, there are three things that happen when you do medical device security from an operations perspective. And operations, I mean security operations, IT operations, biomed even, is number one, training, right? You are going from taking care of traditional IT environments into mixing together technologies that these engineers, analysts either don't know about or know about them, but don't have enough information to deal with, or are scared to perform an enforcement action because they know this has some kind of operational impact. So that means that how you approach response, from what Mike and John were saying, how do I contain an incident? And, you know, I'm doing it in 6 hours today. I need to be in 10 minutes, but in 3 months type of thing, to recovery, to John's point. How much data loss can an organization take? How much can you be out of service, right? Those things matter. So workforce training, education is very, very important. And this is where partnerships come into play, because most often than not, you're not going to have enough people, enough money to do this. So this is, for example, where, you know, organizations like Critical Insight bring a tremendous value here to be able to have the expertise to help your organization push forward of how to grow that capability as you grow forward, understanding that, hey, it takes time for you to take action when the system says something is wrong, for you to go into another system to investigate another system to then take enforcement action and then see if it worked or not and deploy resources as necessary. That was number one. Number two, it's also a question of human factors. So human factors in the sense of clinical workflow. We all know organizations, especially healthcare in the US, is dependent upon volume and throughput of physicians. So when you talk about medical devices and the security of them, anything that impacts clinical workflow will have to be dealt with in the appropriate way. So this means involving the medical exec committee, involving the appropriate chairs of the departments where there's impact to clinician workflow, whether that's on the nursing side, the tech side, or the physician side, because that will have an impact on the ability for you to be able to respond appropriately. The last piece, number 3, is what we talked about this on the tail end of the last slide, which was please pull in the emergency management folks together with the folks that do business continuity and disaster recovery, because they are already doing prioritization of what needs to be recovered first. This can be an additional data point for them to help you function better on that piece.
And, and then Mike, actually, you know what, on this slide, I'm going to move forward because I just realized we have 13 minutes left.
I'll add one quickie thing here, and it's about, when there's an actual incident, let's just be really clear about this. If something really goes down, here's your incident response plan, call the insurance company.
Yes.
Because your contract says that's the phone call you're going to make, and it says they're going to be in charge. So there are ways that you can avoid making that phone call if you have an effective incident response program, policy, process in place, and you've drilled it before, and there's ways to put out these little fires. But that fire gets out of control, you're calling the insurance company.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And Mike, you want to talk about dynamic threat landscape?
Yeah, I did want to talk about this. So, in the points that were made in that first article that we showed, right? So, the fact that the threats change constantly. Here's the blocking and tackling that everybody needs to be doing right here, okay? Yes, you have regulatory compliance obligations to meet. Yes, there are standards of practice that are there, even if you're not regulated, but you all are. Focusing on vulnerabilities, we've talked a lot about that, but here's your playbook right here. There are things that you need to do weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annually, and you need to tick those off mostly in a business mind, because it's a requirement, it's a regulatory requirement. But the benefit of actually doing these things is you have process in place, so you can survive these incidents and put out the little fire before it gets out of control. If you're serious about this kind of process here, this is the management of your information security program. And if you're not doing all of these things, you might want to take a screenshot right now, or I guess we're going to distribute this later.
We'll send out the deck.
Okay. But it's every quarter a couple of things have to be done, right? We need to do our annual policy review. We need to do a tabletop exercise, a penetration test. We need to do vendor risk management, which is a huge issue that we've all had to deal with, given that the trend is for third parties, the unlocked window, to be used to go after the health sector. And we've seen a whole bunch of hospitals almost simultaneously go down because they all shared a vendor that was compromised. So, here's the playbook right here for the blocking and tackling. And if you're doing these things, you're already ahead of the game.
Mike, can I jump in here?
Yeah.
Two things you can do here that's a really good benefit for the biomed people is most biomed or clinical engineering sometimes is outsourced for third-party contracts, and those are 7-8 figures. This process can be a very good, essentially objective data output to say how effective their management is doing. So you can use this as a negotiating pivot point to drive down operation costs.
That's a good point. That's a good idea. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mike.
Okay, so what we've talked about is the fact that we need to identify what's on the network, especially medical devices, because the potential impact here could be loss of life, which would be debilitating to anyone's brand. Armis has a product that does exactly that. It's going to identify all of these IoT things. It's going to identify your OT. If you have programmable logic controllers, right? The way we have here, I'll pick a example. So we work with the largest port in our state. And they have things that move train tracks and bridges up and down and things like this. And the value of the goods coming in and out of the country is such that we really don't want any of that to be disrupted any more than it already has been for other reasons. So the fact that the Armis product will discover everything on the network, create the inventory, understand the attributes of everything, whether or not it needs a firmware upgrade, for example, and then start to baseline the behavior of these assets on the network such that when something throws off an alert because something weird just happened that's never happened before, somebody's got to get the alert. And that's how we partner. That's in terms of vendors working together. That's what we do. We do the 24/7, 365 monitoring, and our SOC will ingest those alerts. We have predefined incident response plans and playbooks that we activate when that happens, specifically to help put out little fires before the house is engulfed in flames.
And, just really quickly, what the two companies are. That was a pretty good description of Armis Summit. What do you want to add about Armis?
No, just one thing, like to Mike's point, like we help you secure your patient's journey, right? That's not a tagline. That's something that I'm passionate for, given I've been in healthcare now about 19 years of my career, right? So one thing that we do is we help you identify from not only security perspective what you have, we do it passively, but we also help you gain clinical context through utilization. And we help you leverage your existing investments that you already have more appropriately, as well as help create, like we talked about earlier, those risk bindings that don't exist normally or are hard to implement and maintain. That's what we do for you.
And then Critical Insight, we do HIPAA risk assessments, 24/7 SOC, penetration tests, incident planning, incident response,
and we tabletop exercises.
Tabletop. Oh yeah, we talked about that in tabletop exercises. But and well integrated with whatever you already have on your system, especially if it's Armis. And one of the other things about us is we became the first preferred provider for the American Hospital Association when they went out and looked for what cybersecurity solutions to or what partners they wanted to recommend. So that was my one marketing moment. We've had questions going throughout this, so I'm going to leave this up while if people want to put in other questions, which is our email address is there. And mine's there if you want to talk about how to talk to the press or anything, and my cell phone, because, people, when somebody calls our 800 number, they talk to me at 2 a.m., which, I'm happy to take. But those are a sucker. Because I'm a sucker. That's right. That's true. Yep. Aaron knows me well. So now Aaron owes me a drink at Vive in March. Hey, so one question that came up here. So, all of this is true, but ROI, for security initiatives is hard to articulate. What are some metrics that can showcase value? John and Summit. John, do you want to go first on how you talk about ROI and then Summit?
Sure.
Yeah. So, again, it's hard. It's hard to put a value. I'm actually anxious to hear Summit's take on this, because it's hard to put a value on things that you stop and don't allow to happen. And certainly that's part of the value add that as a CISO, you relate back to leadership and board is, here's all the things that are trying to get in, and here's all the things that we stopped. But that only goes so far. And when you're spending millions of dollars potentially, depending on the size of the organization, CFOs typically want some kind of return on investment to tie to that spend. And again, security is one of those things that is behind the scenes until it's not. And so I always lead, just to reinforce what we've already talked about, lead with what's the value of your brand. And additionally, what would it cost, right? What would it cost your brand if something happened? And then support that with that risk equation that Mike was talking about, because organizations understand risk. And those are the approaches I've taken in the past.
Summit?
Sure. So I break it up into three areas. Historically, what I've done is One is your traditional KPI section, right? So this is, I align with where Mike was coming from before, was not really giving the board jargon or even CIOs the jargon of, hey, we had thousands of alerts and stuff like that. No, it was more a capability conversation to say, hey, we spent $500,000 getting this thing in a span of 9 months. Our average time to respond to incidents, both actual incidents versus drilled incidents, has gone from, let's say, 3 days to 30 minutes, right? That would be examples of KPIs. The other one would be help desk reporting times, right? Trying to bridge InfoSec to IT operations, because depending upon size of healthcare organization and the type of makeup, you may have an outsourced help desk that are fielding calls for security operations, right? Whether that's errors or issues with configurations, patching requests, or in general, like device priority workflow type situations. So those would be another category of KPIs that I would track, that I would give to say, hey, by spending X amount of dollars for doing this kind of self-service or automated security or vulnerability management or employee self-service, you're driving down the calls to the help desk or field tech services. That would be number 2. And from a biomed perspective, safety incidents is huge. So most of the time, biomed management systems do not have an automated way to track safety recalls with the appropriate associated assets. So anytime you can automate that through a security solution or through improving the biomed management system function, that becomes a very high, not only management KPI, but also a risk KPI as well from that perspective. So that's in general, the KPIs that you could use. But on the data interoperability side, you could almost leverage these potential ROIs as being, hey, if I have utilization, for example, the one we took for the CT scanners, and I'm pushing that to the clinical analytics engine, now you have a potential avenue for the team that does orders for admissions to be able to say, hey, this investment in the medical device security strategy helped me reduce patient wait times because I was able to handle utilization better, right? Those things are very possible right now because of the analytics platforms that are existing in most healthcare institutions. And it can be done in Excel as well, depending on how good the person is. So those are the examples of KPIs, data interoperability, ROI, and then obviously reporting. This is very helpful for not only your compliance departments, but also insurance. Most insurance policies, as they come up for renewal now, require you to prove operational compliance with appropriate security measures that you have in your environment. So that is where these kind of solutions help by driving down your insurance policy costs. And the last piece I'll draw is on the operational cost savings, which is providing biomed or your chief financial officer something to say, hey, you spent 10 million with Siemens, Philips, whoever, or Crothall managing your stuff. They promise do this. This is what they're really doing. Go ask for money back.
So let's do quick final thoughts from everybody.
Well, I want to tie my final thought back to that.
Fine, go ahead.
All right. So the easy ones are frequency of incidents, cost per incident, time to incident close. When you get into that middle tier, Summit made a great point. Insurance costs. If you can make insurance costs go down, you have a metric you can hold up that's got a dollar sign attached to it that the executives are going to love. But let's just rip off the scab here. These are the days of class action suits and executive gross negligence. And if you are protecting executives from claims of negligence and class action suits, they're in your camp, right? We're helping to protect. When I was in the public sector, it's all about, we're keeping you from being above the fold. Well, it's the same thing. So, realize the psychology of what's going on here and who actually has something to lose. So I would, speak to the executives very frankly about this.
Summit, quick final thoughts.
It's a team, but please bring appropriate clinical organizational leadership to do this.
John.
I would say the proliferation of IoT and IoMT devices is not going to slow down. So do yourself a favor and get yourself a good security partner like Critical Insight and Armis.
Ooh, I like that final thought. And with that, we'll give it to Aaron.
Thanks, guys. I'm just going to take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate you joining us live and showing up for Jake, Michael, John, and Summit. And thanks to you guys from the ARMIS and the Critical Insight team. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this information with our members. And I'm just going to remind you guys, make sure to fill out the survey that's going to pop up in your web browser. If you were a little shy and didn't want to ask a question, or you have a comment about the great content that was presented today, please be sure to fill that out and I will make sure to get it to Jake and his team. Otherwise, everyone have a really great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.